We'll hear now from Myra Burton. Myra?
Thanks, Nathaniel. I wanted to talk a bit about the role of the Foreign Relations series in promoting government openness and transparency. I came to the office in June of 2001. I was a freeway flyer out in San Diego County going from one end of the county to the other, rolling back the frontiers of ignorance. When I got back into a 9-to-5 job, I thought, well, this is just nirvana. I sat down, I was assigned the Southern Africa Nixon Ford administration volume, and I was told that I was covered under this 1991 statute, which allowed me access to any government agency's documents that did anything overseas. So, I want to talk a bit about the dream and the reality of that particular statute. Yes, there is a law saying that I get to see these documents. However, I found that once I passed my clearances and actually started going into these collections, the reality was very, very different. It's not that I wasn't given access, but that the things researchers face all the time were occurring writ large in terms of classified documentation. First of all, incomplete collections. I'm sure anyone who has done any research has had to deal with this sort of thing. A document you know is supposed to be there, you simply can't find. Or there's one page and the rest of the pages are missing, that sort of thing. Inadequate finding aids, another nightmare. They may or may not correspond with what's actually in the boxes. And so you know something is supposed to be there, the finding aid says it's there, but it isn't there. And then the last and perhaps biggest nightmare that I faced compiling this particular volume, no finding aids whatsoever. You don't know what you don't know because there's no finding aid to tell you anything. And this was largely a problem with the Central Intelligence Agency. Our office had finding aids for some of the collections, but not all of them. And I believe it was in 1991, the office created a position to help us with this. And that was the position of the Joint Historian. And that person worked for both us and the Central Intelligence Agency. They served as like a liaison and were in place to work difficult issues between the two agencies, but also to do research for us, because once they were vested in CIA, they had access to databases and finding aids the rest of us knew nothing about. My volume dealt with a fairly significant covert operation in Angola, and so this was a huge benefit to me. I was able to see documents that I did not know existed and to incorporate them in my volume. Now, once you get all this documentation together and you decide what you're going to include in your volume, you do the annotation, you hand it over for review. If you have a covert action or something that's very sensitive, the last part of your job as a compiler is to write an issue statement. And that issue statement is basically a justification for the release of classified information. It's an interesting dance, I have to say. Basically, what we're looking for when we try to justify the release of classified material is whether or not that material or that information is already in the public domain. And in a lot of instances, it is. In the case of Angola, it was covered extensively in the New York Times. And so, you know, if someone was going to say, we're not going to declassify a 40 committee meeting, I could say, well, it's actually mentioned on such and such a date in the New York Times. So that helps a great deal. Other scholars may have already released this sort of information. Another part of justifying this is what will the impact of the release of this material be? Is it going to potentially lead to problems for sources that have given us this information? Will it harm U.S. relations with other governments? Will it release information that we don't want other people to know? And so I can make a guess, I can argue a point, but at the end of the day, the people who actually have equity in these documents are the ones that make that decision. So I bundled off my little justifications and my volume, and it went to the declassification side of our office. And all of these documents are sent out to agencies who determine their equities in these documents and decide to either release it in full, which we love, or they redact small portions, major portions, or worst case scenario, they deny a document in full. This is not the end of the story, but it's where the real negotiations begin. Sometimes those negotiations just involve a few members of the office staff and the people who were involved in declassification in these other agencies. When these topics are particularly important to a volume, they're central to the issue, sometimes it gets bumped up a notch and will go to the assistant secretary level. In worst case scenarios, and I'm not really sure if this has ever happened, it goes further up the chain. But at the end of the day, the person who has control of that equity decides whether or not that is going to be released. If they decide they are not going to release that information, all is not lost again, because we have a system in place to let people know that document actually exists. I like to call it the breadcrumb trail. It's basically what we call T&T, title, no text. And what this does is to give you a description of the document. You're not going to see what's in it, but you know if it's a memorandum of conversation, if it's a letter or a telephone conversation, you know when it occurred, and we give you the source note, so you know where to find it. Unless any of the information in that is classified, which of course would be redacted, you know that this document exists, you know how to get it eventually. It's the eventually that's the sticky part. A lot of times documents are denied because of political sensitivity, diplomatic sensitivities, the release of sources and methods, strategic information, and sometimes that changes over time. So something that is a hot potato in 2011, 10 years from now might best be a lukewarm tater tot. And you can go back and you can get that information because you know that document exists. So I think that the Foreign Relations series is crucial in that effort. Now, in addition to leaving these breadcrumb trails, we also continue to try and get these documents declassified. And we can do that now because all of our volumes are published online in addition to those that are published in hard copy. So that if 5 years down the line we finally get permission to print something, we can just stick it up online for everyone to see. And that's been a real benefit to us. Now, we've talked a lot today about the importance of openness in government to people in the United States. But it's very, very important what our series does for people around the globe. In many instances, people don't know anything about what their governments are doing, and they learn about it in the Foreign Relations series. So I think we play a vital role in that as well. We've had tremendous accomplishments with this series. In the 150 years that we've been compiling this, we've released over 400 volumes. It's a tremendous amount of information that does get out that people often don't discuss because we like to look at the problem areas. So I think that FRUS is a vital tool in this whole idea of opening up government information to the world, not just to Americans. And I hope that we will continue to do this series for the next 150 years and beyond, and maybe by that time, all of my documents will have been fully released.
Thank you very much, Myra.